You are listening to the Visualising War and Peace podcast. In each episode, we look at how people have experienced, described, or imagined armed conflict in different periods and places, and we discuss the impact which representations of war and peace can have on us as individuals and societies. Hello, my name is Alice Koenig, and I direct the Visualising War and Peace project at the University of St Andrews. My guest today is Dr. Joseph Scales, a Marie Curie Postdoctoral Fellow in the Department of Religion, Philosophy and History at the University of Agder in Norway. Joe's doctoral research analysed spaces of Jewish identity in ancient Galilee, looking particularly at the impact of material culture on personal, communal and regional identity formation during the Hasmonean dynasty from 100 BCE onwards. His book Galiliean Spaces of Identity will be published this year. Joe's work on Jewish and Hellenistic identities and on their cross-cultural interactions has led to further research on ancient Jewish texts written in Greek, which enable us to understand aspects of the shared culture of the ancient Mediterranean world. And he's become very interested in women's practices and rituals in Judaism. Both of these research interests feed into his current project called Fighting Talk, Motivating Violence in Ancient Judaism, which examines the nature of pre-battle speeches in ancient Jewish texts and their relationship to established forms of pre-battle exhortation in Greek and Roman sources. Because the politics of the region in this period are so complex, we've decided to record a part 1 and a part 2 for this podcast. In this episode, part 1, Joe will talk us through Jewish interactions with other groups and political powers in the region from around 175 BCE to the early 2nd century CE, to help us understand the history of Judea and Jerusalem and the ways in which ongoing conflict near and far shaped Jewish practice and identity, not just at the time, but for many centuries afterwards. In part 2, which we hope you'll also listen to because it's super interesting, Joe will dive deep into some of the textual sources from the period, looking particularly at the ways in which they visualized battle itself and justified war, particularly through pre-battle speeches. So Joe, thank you very much for joining me for this mega recording session. I'm really looking forward to picking your brains, both about historical conflicts and textual visualizations of those conflicts in a range of sources. Welcome to the Visualising War and Peace podcast.
Thank you. It's really nice to be here.
So, Joe, your current research project looks at texts that span around 300 years of history from the 2nd century BCE through to the emergence of Christianity and beyond. And I wonder if we can start by getting to grips with some of the key political and cultural developments in that period, which is a period that saw Jewish communities persecuted by Hellenistic kings and Roman emperors besieging Jerusalem. So if you can give us a bit of a rundown, perhaps starting with Antiochus IV, who ruled the Seleucid Empire from 175 BCE until 164. Who was he, and how did he end up triggering what later became known as the Maccabean Revolt?
Yeah, so this is immediately going to get quite complicated, given the fragmentary nature of a lot of the history that we'll be touching on. So my presentation is necessarily going to be kind of the synthesis of a lot of this information, but I would always encourage people to go and check out more research in this area, and there's a huge amount of literature. But essentially, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, or Epiphanes as he's called, is this Seleucid king, a member of the Diadochoi kingdoms in the wake of Alexander the Great's death and breakup of this kind of large empire or kingdom in the ancient Near East. And after kind of a long period of what we might think of as Seleucid hegemony, we begin to get the kind of breakdown of this kingdom. And really this coincides with the rise of the Roman Empire as a cultural force or imperial power in this end of the Mediterranean. So significantly before this, Antiochus's father, unfortunately also named Antiochus, but Antiochus III the Great, he lost a big kind of face-off against the Romans a few decades before this. And as a result, Antiochus ends up being a hostage in Rome in his youth. So he's really acculturated to Rome and becomes kind of a member of this elite. Let's say this is quite a common practice for a defeated kingdom in the ancient world to exchange these kind of members of the court, and it guarantees a form of the peace. So Antiochus spends a lot of formative years there. And in the background to this, the Seleucids are also paying off a war debt, an absolutely massive war debt that they owe to the Romans. Again, this is part of the peace conditions. So by the time we get to this period, the Seleucids are not as powerful as they were. They've kind of been shown to not be the ultimate masters in the area. Only a few years before this period of ancient Judea, this southern Levant region was reconquered by the Seleucids from a rival dynastic kingdom, the Ptolemies, who had for around 100 years had control of the region. So all this is kind of in the milieu of the background. We've got a bit of fragmentization of this powerful kingdom, this empire, and we have the appearance on the scene of some other cultural forces, such as the Romans. Antiochus ascends to the throne. This seems to be quite a slick operation where perhaps he removes some other potential claimants, and he wants to really rebuild some of the inspirational hegemony of the kingdom. And he goes about by having some triumphs. He goes to war with Ptolemaic Egypt, and caught up in the middle is this kind of small regional state. So at this time, Judea is a very, very small place. It's not this kind of greater Israel as imagined in the biblical period of the northern and southern kingdoms, but it's quite a small territory. And it's largely organized around this Jerusalem temple. So a very important cultic center in the region. And what happens is Antiochus ends up, again, losing face to the Romans. There's this quite important face-off he has just in sight of the walls of Alexandria on one of the campaigns. And he's almost made to back down in this really famous narrative where a Roman consul draws a circle around him in the sand with a stick and tells him to make up his mind what he will do before leaving that circle. Essentially, he decides to back down and withdraws. And this seems to be, according to at least some of the history, where Antiochus first sacks the Jerusalem temple. Maybe this is to pay off some war debt. Maybe this is because he's taking out some rage on the region. There's also some theories around the temple authorities. Some of the priests there had perhaps promised him some money because usually there's some kind of transactional, or at least generally between Seleucids and local temples, they have some transactional thing between a high priest who guarantees some money, and then they get the high priesthood. Maybe this is happening, at least the work of Second Maccabees seems to suggest this. But for whatever reason, Antiochus at least once, maybe twice, sacks the Jerusalem temple, and this seems to be recorded. And at another point, he also seems to set up this change in cultic observances. All of our sources, so the main Jewish sources for this interaction, are from the book of Daniel and the first and second books of the Maccabees. And they tell slightly different stories, but they're all very negative about essentially whatever it is that Antiochus seems to do. This then also seems to blow up, and there seems to be a party within Judea at the time who are interested in adapting their cultural practice or becoming a bit more like Seleucid cultural practice. And they get into conflict with some people who are not happy with this at all. And this really seems to be the explosive mix that kicks off the so-called Maccabean rebellion or revolt. If we read books of the Maccabees, particularly First Maccabees, which is a propagandistic work, kind of that originates from the Hasmonean court, perhaps more than half a century after the events it's initially describing, then we get the impression that there are lots of people who are betraying all these kind of cultural ideas and practices. And this family, headed up by a patriarch called Mattathias, Hasmonean, where we get the Hasmonean dynasty from, essentially takes the lead in violent resistance against this perceived change in cultural practice. And this is cracked down upon by successive Seleucid regimes. There's a very confusing mix of elements that are going on here, and the texts we have available to us give us some window into those different flows in the culture at the time. Some people are a lot more clear than I am about exactly what was happening, but I'm just trying to take us through what perhaps was going on, some of the wider cultural things that are going on. Essentially, this is remembered in Jewish sources as a persecution that's changing cultural practice, and we get stories of martyrdom, particularly in Second Maccabees, makes a really big deal out of this. We get a story of temple renewal, where whatever Antiochus had done to the temple was overturned, and Judah Maccabee Maccabee, incidentally, comes from his nickname, the Hammer. So it's quite a cool nickname. But he reinstitutes some kind of temple practice. And over time, eventually this group becomes part of this power landscape in the region. So some of them are legitimized, some of them break away more completely, but they really cement themselves as quite a powerful dynasty for the next almost 100 years. And their legacy goes on beyond this. But their initial rise is characterized by a resistance to a perceived persecution.
Wow, a very messy history, as you say, all sorts of different pitches for power, pitches for control, conflicts arising almost tangentially from others. The motivations and the actual events unclear, although narrated in much more linear, clear ways by some later texts. So we're looking at events from around 167 BCE. Judas Maccabeus dies in 160 BC, and another Jewish leader succeeded at that point, I think, in taking back control of Jerusalem from the Greeks. Is that right? And if so, can you tell us a little bit more about how that came about and how events then transpired from 160 onwards?
Yeah, so initially this family, that I think there were 4 brothers, maybe 5, a number of them are named in the books of the Maccabees. They seem to have initial success and conflict with armies sent by different Seleucid kings and generals. But generally, there seems to be a little bit of initial success and popularity that groups around them, and they take back control of the temple at some point. And then there's the rededication, and this becomes commemorated in the festival of Hanukkah, which is still celebrated. So they very early on build this into a commemorative calendar that's set up, and they're almost intrinsically linked with it. But this happens perhaps around 164, 163. Our sources are a little bit unclear on this. So we know that Antiochus IV dies around 164. He's on a campaign off in Mesopotamia, and allegedly, again, this is all kind of secondhand reporting, but he's trying to sack another temple, and he's struck down by an illness or is injured or whatever happens. Now, in First Maccabees, he dies after the temple is rededicated by Judah, and in Second Maccabees, he dies before. And this is more to do, slightly unclear who perhaps is right chronologically, but Second Maccabees is much more interested in temple propaganda, essentially, and diminishing the kind of Hasmonean control over this. It's telling an alternative narrative. Whereas in First Maccabees, as I alluded to earlier, it's propaganda for this dynasty. So it really is kind of tying them with re-establishing proper practice here. Jumping forward, there's still some violent rebellion going on. There is a fortress in Jerusalem, which is sited kind of opposite the temple, maybe on one end. Slightly unclear why, but this seems to stay occupied for another 2 decades after the temple is initially rededicated, let's say. So there's, at least for me, a lack of clarity around exactly what's going on in this period. Scholars and historians try to kind of say things like, well, they didn't really need to take the fortress here. They weren't really bothering anyone. For me, I think this is perhaps some evidence of maybe that there's something going on between legitimization of the dynasty themselves within Seleucid circles. So it's not 20 years of war, but it's perhaps 20 years of flare-ups of conflict and closer and more distant relationships between figures in this prominent family and the kind of official Seleucid power. So it gets very messy, but essentially there's a succession of Hasmonean brothers. So we have Jonathan takes over, he becomes high priest. We also have Simon after him, another brother, and then Simon's son, John Hyrcanus, becomes high priest, I think around 135. And then even now we're finding there's another Antiochus VII, Sidetes, who ends up capturing Jerusalem again, I think around 128 BCE, around this kind of period. And what we're seeing is this constant, almost negotiation over who is in charge. And it's just a very, very messy and difficult picture to get a view of, like a grand tactical campaign or a history of the conflict, when it is told in a very condensed way, but we're kind of given details for this year or this thing that happens. But the perception, at least as far as I can make out, seems to be that there's much more fluidity in the situation going on. And conveniently at this time, the Seleucids are also embroiled in their own civil war. So they've got multiple claimants to the Seleucid kingdom, and it's going through a period of disintegration, essentially. So this is a microcosm of a wider picture of this Hellenistic kingdom's decline and breakup, because there are much more serious political powers emerging in the kind of eastern parts of the Seleucid Empire. So Bactrians, Parthians, these other figures or other groups. So we're in this little corner of the Seleucid Empire, and they seem to be trying to use the local power base to their own ends, often in further dynastic power struggles.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've mentioned Rome as well as one of the other very significant powers that's destabilizing the region. And as I understand it, the Hasmonean dynasty lasted until Herod the Great, who was sort of hand in glove with the Roman Empire, defeated the last Hasmonean ruler and became a Roman client king himself.
And he marries one of the Hasmonean daughters as well. So one of the daughters of the final kind of Hasmonean rulers. Essentially, Herod masterfully in some ways manages to, he initially appears in kind of Roman circles as a backer or backed by Mark Antony, and even names his fortress in Jerusalem the Antonina after Mark Antony. But then after the Battle of Actium is able to pivot very, very successfully and become on very good terms with Octavian. So he's playing some very adept political games and manages to survive and solidify his power base, and also stays with the Romans, while the Hasmoneans in 40 to 37, this kind of remnant of the Hasmonean power base, Antigonus Matthias, throws his lot in with the Parthians, who are also kind of fighting in the region. So once again, we have this small kingdom that is taking part in these larger kind of it is a proxy for lots of these larger campaigns as well. So when we think of a wider picture of conflict in this period, we have to really put it in a nexus of a very, very turbulent period in the ancient world. But what period wasn't turbulent in the ancient world from this perspective in some sense?
Yeah, indeed. And that nexus of overlapping conflicts, proxy wars, as you say. But you've helped us picture Judea here as a small territory in the midst of all of this, all of these bigger power plays, dominated by the Temple of Jerusalem, by Jerusalem itself, changing hands, being destroyed, being retaken, being rededicated, and so on. So I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about what impact these events had on Jewish identity formation and expressions of Jewish nationhood.
Conflict is such a fertile ground upon which to do identity construction, because a lot is at stake, and you really have an opportunity to coalesce around some quite key ideas. So what we see in this period is partly conflict is explained on the basis of conflict in identity. So going back to the Maccabean revolt, it's a sense of what really matters in terms of Jewish observance of the law, in terms of practice, maybe in terms of belief, but we should probably stick more with this concept of observance in emerging Judaism at this period. So these questions around who we are and what do we do become really important, and are made important by political leaders and military leaders. And in the retelling of these conflicts, we're kind of left with their perception of what was going on and what they wanted to build on it. So if I go to a contemporary source, for instance, in the Maccabean revolt, so generally scholars think that the book of Daniel in the form we might now have it is at least parts of it are being written in this period. And in Daniel 11, we have this character, the king of the north, who is identified as Antiochus. And for most of the first part of Daniel 11, it seems to describe what we know he did, and then it detours, and this helps us kind of perhaps date when this section at least was written. But we get in Daniel 11, in 36, the king acts as he pleases. He'll exalt himself, considers himself greater than God, and speaks horrendous things against the God of gods. A few more details. He doesn't pay respect to gods of his ancestors or any other god. And then he also ransacks fortresses and does all this other kind of stuff. And we also get a sense of him setting up the desolating sacrilege, which is this different temple arrangement, and kind of consorting with people who violate the covenant, some of this other language. But it's quite vague. The books of the Maccabees are much more specific about what they consider to have been the things people were doing. And this includes at least adopting things that are considered maybe more Greek. So going to the gymnasium and maybe also exercising naked there, or they are perhaps allowing Gentiles into the court where there is into the temple courts, and there's meant to be a clear division between where all the nations can go, and then beyond a certain delimitation they can't. And the books of the first Maccabees suggest that one of the priests, this Alchemus, actually tries to demolish this wall that separates this. So we get a retelling of what the enemies were doing, and we get an explanation of why it is, particularly in the revolt, that the Maccabees, the Hasmoneans, went to the lengths they did. And a lot of the justification is on the basis of defense of this concept of the law or observance of the fathers or the ancestors. And this is along with Hanukkah, as I mentioned, they're creating a sense of, we might say religious identity, but it's a bit of a slippery term. So maybe a national identity or something else, but it's a culture that is being shaped by people who have the levers of power, essentially. They may well be incredibly popular, and this is by general agreement, but we definitely also know that there were other groups in the time when the Hasmoneans were at their apogee that they are not the most popular. There seem to be conflicts with groups who have certain understandings of law in a particular sense, or certain beliefs, or should the king occupy the position of high priest, which is a really big thing that comes up. We're kind of left with the narratives that survived and the narratives that were passed down. And these are almost all we have to go on what was actually going on. And, this trite thing to say about history written by the victors, but when we get a sense of who were these people in this time, we're often reading dominant cultural narratives about who we are. And this concept of the subaltern is we're not able to hear from the so-called Hellenizers of the temple. There's no sources for what they had to say about what Judaism was for them. So we're left with only part of the picture.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've helped us understand there, as you say, conflict being this very fertile ground on which to do identity politics, identity formation. So religious and national identity being fought over, being fought for, but then also being the justification for conflict, driving conflict. And as you say, marginalizing certain identities while others become dominant in the sources, if not in reality as well. You've been mentioning a few texts, First Maccabees, Second Maccabees, the Book of Daniel, and I'd like to come back to them, not least to think about the ways in which pre-battle speeches help to justify conflicts ahead of the fighting itself. But I'd like just to turn to another author as well, who's writing a couple of centuries later, after the events you've just been talking about, to take us essentially through to the other end of the period that you look at. And that's Josephus, who wrote the Jewish War and Jewish Antiquities. And Josephus himself lived through another very, very turbulent period in Jewish history when, yet again, Jerusalem was sacked, this time by the emperors Vespasian and Titus as part of the First Jewish-Roman War, sometimes called the Great Jewish Revolt. And we might come back to the names that are given to these rebellions, revolts, and wars and so on. But I wonder if you can just give us a quick rundown, really, of events from the end of the Hasmonean dynasty to the start of this conflict, the First Roman-Jewish War in 66 CE.
Yeah, so we've touched on kind of Herod and Parthian revolts. Herod essentially establishes quite a strong dynasty. He's remarkably successful at what he does, and then dies shortly before this turn the millennia, but perhaps around 4 BCE, and bequeaths his kingdom to his sons, who essentially have it divided amongst them, and this is ratified by, at this point, Augustus. So we then get these tetrarchies and ethnarchies and these other kind of terms for kings who are maybe not quite full kings. But so this is where we get Herod Antipas of the New Testament of the Gospels, who is king in Galilee for almost 4 decades. And we also get a number of other kind of groups. We also get some direct management from Roman consuls, the most famous of them being Pontius Pilate, who you may have heard of. But he is just one of many who have these kind of more oversight directly in Jerusalem itself. And Josephus is our main source for the revolt. We also have a number of indications from archaeology of the extent of it. But Josephus is a figure who is writing from Rome after he has essentially been brought into the Flavian dynasty in some fashion. So he's captured during the revolt and a prisoner, and then he's released. And in his works, he really is presenting an incredibly Roman-friendly and Flavian-friendly account of the run-up to this period. But in his characterization of these years in the run-up to 66 CE, he's presenting lots and lots of flare-ups, lots and lots of places where particular groups are agitating, resorting to violence, calling on violence, particularly often to overthrow the Roman Empire. And we might even see traces of this in the New Testament around some of the accounts of Jesus' interactions and what he has to say about these things. So that aside, he's got a very deliberate reason for building a narrative towards quite an explosive revolt, but we do have instances of greater and lesser degrees of, for want of a better phrase, Roman interference in the region, particularly some of the stories told about Gaius Caligula Caesar. So this kind of famous emperor who did all sorts of interesting things, but one of the things he was claimed to have wanted to do is put a statue of himself in the Jerusalem temple. And whether this was ever a serious thing or not, riots kicked off about this, and a delegation went from Alexandria, one of the biggest Jewish communities outside of Judea and the surrounding area, went to kind of be delegates to essentially say, this is a terrible idea. You can read Philo's works as well, as he is a representative who goes, and Josephus also mentions this. So we do have some trigger points where it seems as though the Romans don't quite have a good idea necessarily of why certain Jewish practices are the way they are, and also seem to be antagonistic in some ways towards those practices and see them as in all kinds of very negative stereotypes. So this period in the build-up, there's all these potential flashpoints, but in 66 there seems to be a ousting of Roman military force from Judea, and very quickly this sweeps the region. And in Josephus' own account, he's dispatched to Galilee to organize the revolt there. In late 67, 68, Vespasian arrives, and quickly, within a year, he's conquered Galilee, all the fortress holdouts, captured Josephus. And then there's a bit more of a protracted campaign up until the year 70, where the temple is destroyed. Interestingly enough, this also coincides with Vespasian being the final of the Year of the Four Emperors in 69, and almost you could wonder whether, because he is almost the furthest away from action in Rome, he's the last to get there. Last one becomes the emperor. But in 70, by this point, his son Titus has been entrusted with continuing the war operations. And Josephus is at pains to talk about how he didn't want to destroy the temple. He made every effort not to, and then somehow this fire started in the temple. This is slightly hard to believe. In 70, the temple's destroyed, and then there are ongoing operations to kind of quell the last holdouts until perhaps 73. There's this very famous story of the mountain fortress in the Judean desert at Masada. There's a really good book by Jody Magnus that people can read on that, about the myth of Masada, because this also takes part in identity formation now for the modern state of Israel, or at least used to much more than it currently does. So there's this accounts of this really significant moment where Judaism, at least from certain power bases, has really structured a lot of its practices around the existence of a temple in Jerusalem. And there is suddenly not one. And this raises all sorts of questions about what do we do? Quickly, perhaps jumping ahead to the so-called Bar Kokhba revolt, which is 132 to 135 CE. We get a very organized uprising in the region led by this Simon Bar Kokhba, or nicknamed Bar Kokhba, means son of the star. There is all kind of thought about, is he deliberately recalling some messianic beliefs, this, that, and the other. The revolt is initially very successful. It's very well planned, but this is not allowed to essentially happen under the Emperor Hadrian, and he destroys Jerusalem. He expels the Jews from the immediate region, and this kind of is the last time at which this temple rebuilding ideology is a plan in ancient Judaism, as in something that people are actually trying to make happen in the imminent future rather than a future expectation. And then this is where Judaism, having lost this center, then a new ongoing tradition based, at least in part, in Galilee and in the sharing of rabbinic texts. So these kind of sayings of the rabbis that will later form the Mishnah and then go on to the Talmud and all these other kind of wonderful textual traditions. The lack of a temple almost in some ways presages what will then go on to a huge degree of discussion, debate, and ideas about what is Judaism now. So we see this evolving tradition that is marked at these points with quite serious attacks on quite central ideas about what it means to be part of this community.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that whirlwind tour that's really helped us build a picture. Very complex, increasingly fraught relations between Jewish, Greek, and Roman communities across the ancient Mediterranean over several hundred years, with Greek and Roman political powers repeatedly driving Jewish people from their homelands, disenfranchising them in a range of ways, and with conflict really, really shaping Jewish identity, Jewish self-expression as well. You know, conflict really being very fundamental to the way in which Judaism develops and the way in which Jewish nationhood develops over this period.
As I noted at the start of our conversation, this episode is just part one of a two-part podcast series. Having helped us get to grips with some of the political history of conflict in and around Judea in antiquity, Joe is going to join us for part two, when he will dig deeper into some of the texts that he's been mentioning today and help us unpick some ancient narrative habits of visualizing, anticipating, and justifying different wars in the era. So I'm really looking forward to that. And I hope that you, our listeners, will tune in again to hear Joe discuss more of this fascinating material that so far we've just got some very tantalizing glimpses of. Joe, thank you very much for your input today, helping us get to grips with such complex, overlapping power struggles and conflicts, and above all, helping us to understand, if only briefly, what impact all of that conflict had in antiquity on Jewish identity and self-expression. As always, thanks again to you, our listeners, for joining us. Please do keep supporting our project by sharing our podcast with family, friends, and colleagues. And if you would like to join the conversation further, you can follow us on social media. Just search for Visualising War, or get in touch directly by emailing us at viswar@standrews.ac.uk. Our theme music was composed by Jonathan Young. The show was mixed by Zafir Gertin. Thank you for listening.